Commend the Regional Independents for putting it forward, and I'm glad to see the Government are accepting it. I think it is important we have cross-party support on this important issue on the development of offshore renewables. I think we're all conscious that in Ireland we face three specific crises currently regarding energy and energy supply. First of these being the rising cost of energy bills, and I think again we're all very conscious of this, that the average household is facing significantly increased costs since all 14 of our energy suppliers have increased prices at least once this year, and in September the Commission for Regulation of Utilities has warned that there will be higher charges due to record demand and indeed reduced supply. And so we have real concerns about fuel poverty for many households over the coming winter. But second, there's also a concern and a crisis building with regard to security and certainty in energy supply. And in response to a parliamentary question tabled by my colleague Deputy Sean Sherlock in recent weeks, we heard that there have been 7 Amber Systems alerts in the past 12 months. And of course, the third and most existential crisis is the urgent need to decarbonise our energy and to avoid a devastating rise in global temperatures due to the climate emergency over the next decade and beyond. We know that in order to address these crises, we do need to develop significantly our capacity for offshore wind generation. But I think all of us will have seen the report from Wind Energy Ireland, and I'm grateful to them for supplying the briefing, setting out their concerns that we're not currently on track to reach our renewable energy targets through offshore wind generation. We know that by 2030 we must increase our generation of electricity from renewable sources from 30% to at least 70 or 80 or indeed 80%. We must bring about a 30% reduction in CO2 emissions and a 32.5% improvement of energy efficiency. And we're also, I think, all conscious the robust, fair and transparent planning framework for offshore renewables must form a part of this puzzle. And indeed that we need to see greatly enhanced grid capacity. And again, looking at Wind Energy Ireland, they say that we need a stronger grid and we need to develop further our delivery of onshore wind capacity in order to meet renewable targets. But we're still lacking, Minister, the detailed annex and with the timeline in it that was promised when the Climate Action Plan was published some weeks ago now, and indeed I and my party welcomed the ambitious but necessary targets in the Climate Action Plan. We want to work constructively to see that those targets are indeed reached, but we're concerned that without that detailed annex we simply don't have the necessary level of information to see how we are going to reach those targets and what are the steps to be taken in the next year, in the next few months and in the next decade to reach those targets. And I see that the Climate Change Advisory Council has today published a very critical review of government's approach to reaching those targets, with Marie Donnelly pointing out time lags in implementation, gaps between ambition and practical implementation, and in particular referring to the absence of publication of that detailed annex and timeline, which I have previously asked about in this House. I've asked you, Minister, and indeed Minister Ryan about that. So I think we really need to see that detail, and it's the same then when we look at offshore wind capacity. And anyone who's had the pleasure pre-COVID times of flying into Copenhagen Airport will have seen the mass of offshore wind turbines out at sea. It's no surprise therefore when we see that Denmark is leading the way in offshore renewables. But we don't yet have anything like that capacity or that infrastructure, or indeed the investment necessary to develop that infrastructure to see us increasing our offshore wind generation in the way we need to do so. And we know that, of course, demand for electricity is going to increase as we increasingly electrify our transport and all of our other amenities. So we need to move much more urgently on offshore wind. And we're having this debate not only in the context of the critical review from the Climate Change Advisory Council, but also in the context of repeated warnings from EirGrid Chief Executive Mark Foley about the challenges in meeting our targets, and of course the announcement of the withdrawal of Equinor from Ireland in recent weeks. So while I think we all know that the establishment of MARA, the Maritime Area Regulatory Authority, will form a significant step in the creation of a better planning and infrastructure building system for offshore, we do need to see more urgency. I was glad to hear Minister Ryan outlining a timeline for establishing the auction processes for for renewables, and I note that he has said the first auction he hopes will take place in the final quarter of next year, but we need to see much more urgency on all of these developments. Others have referred to the Ardna Crusher scheme and the huge ambition and huge dynamism around the construction of that hydroelectric scheme around 100 years ago, and indeed this month we're marking the centenary of signing the Anglo-Irish Treaty, but we should also be marking and celebrating the development of Ardna Crusher and channeling that focus and indeed that energy in building very quickly the green energy infrastructure we need, including the offshore wind energy infrastructure. And I think the motion before us does set out some very important points on how we do that. Could I also, Minister, just refer to other renewables and need to have a focus on those? And again, I think that the motion addresses that too. On green hydrogen, I've raised parliamentary questions on this, seeking to explore precisely what initiatives we can take in Ireland to ensure the rollout of green hydrogen in a way that is cost effective, being cognizant that cost of production is currently a huge obstacle to seeing this go forward. I understand that this issue is to be discussed at the EU Council of Energy Ministers this month, and I hope, Minister, that the Irish Government will be proactive in promoting this alternative, and I look forward to getting an update after that meeting has taken place. On solar, I have, like many others, received many queries from constituents in Dublin Bay South requesting an update on the government's microgeneration scheme and on the potential for installing solar panels. This is from individuals, from households, and indeed from schools and sports clubs and others who are keen to do this. We're seeing huge public buy-in to this, just as we're seeing huge public buy-in to moving to EV, to electric vehicles. And yet again, infrastructure not in place. On EVs, really difficult to get EV charging facilities, publicly accessible ones, awaiting still Dublin City Council's plan on this, and it's very frustrating when I'm being asked why we can't simply have more public access EV chargers. Similarly, where people are looking to install solar panels, I've put down parliamentary questions on why we haven't seen new regulations on exemptions for schools seeking to install such panels, for example. And I'm glad to hear that these new regulations are due for publication early next year. But again, people are keen to move now on this micro generation, which is huge potential for community buy-in. On energy storage, in October, I asked Minister Ryan his position in relation to storage of electricity generated from renewables. And I'm glad to see that there's a commitment to incentivise electricity storage in the programme for government. It's mentioned in the Climate Action Plan, but again, we need more detail. And finally, Minister, just to refer to the biodiversity emergency that we're also facing, and to be conscious also that when we're developing offshore infrastructure, that we're not doing it at a cost to our marine biodiversity. Yesterday in this House, I launched the Dublin Bay Bill, which would provide for a new authority, a statutory authority, to promote and enhance environmental protection in Dublin Bay, and I think that initiative is crucial when we're looking at rolling out offshore wind, and indeed when we are anticipating the forthcoming policy statement on port infrastructure necessary to develop offshore wind capacity. So we welcome this motion, we welcome the opportunity to debate this hugely important issue, but we also are anxiously awaiting and seeking, Minister, much more urgent and much more detailed implementation plans from government on offshore wind and all of these other necessary measures to reach our climate targets.